Hi everyone and welcome back to Heimler's History. Okay, now that the revolution has been won, Americans faced a great question. How are we going to govern ourselves? And for that, we need a constitution. And so in this lecture, we're going to talk about America's first constitution, the Articles of Confederation. Let's do it.
It's time to kick it old school.
Now here's where I tell you that the Constitution we know today that has governed our country for centuries is not America's first Constitution. In fact, it is our second Constitution. Our first attempt at a Constitution resulted in a document called the Articles of Confederation. And let's talk for a minute about how the Articles of Confederation got written. So in 1776, when independence was declared, the Continental Congress asked each state to draft a new state-level constitution. And after the war was won and Congress got down to the business of drafting a new federal constitution, they had lots of material to work with. All the states had produced Republican-style governments in which the power to legislate was in the hands of the people. In fact, nearly all the power in the states was invested in the legislative branch, which is to say the lawmaking part of the government. And each of their constitutions intentionally created a weak executive branch, which makes sense because they had just declared independence from a despotic king. It's kind of like dating a guy and when he takes you out to a restaurant, he grabs the menu out of your hand and says, "Yeah, she'll have the crab." And then she says, "But I want the soup." And he says, "You're so cute with your little female brain thinking it knows what it wants." She'll have the crab. And then when she finally breaks up with him, she's probably going to seek out a much weaker guy to date. And so now when they're at the restaurant, she'll say, "I think I want the soup. What do you think?" And he'll say, "Whatever you want, schnookums." And she says, "But I don't know what I want. Do you have an opinion on what I should have?" To which he says, "I want whatever you want, snuffleupagus." And so when the Congress got together to draft a new national constitution, they did much the same thing. They intentionally made the executive weak. So I want to tell you about what this Congress tried in the Articles of Confederation, what did work, and what did not work. So the first thing they had to figure out was who got the power. And they decided that power should be shared between the national government and the states' governments. And the word for this sharing of power is federalism. And this concept has long been a confusing thorn in the side of high school students, so let me try to explain it. When we hear the word federal, we think of the federal government or federal income taxes or whatever. And in that case, federal means the national government, Washington, D.C., the White House, Congress. But that is not what federalism means. Federalism comes from the Latin word foedus, which means something like alliance. Now think of what an alliance is. It's two independent parties sharing resources to accomplish a goal. For example, if it's your responsibility at home to mow the grass and you're feeling like you don't have the energy or power to complete it, you could train your dog to mow the other half. That's an alliance. That's sharing power to accomplish a goal. And that's federalism. It simply means the power to govern is shared between the national government and the state governments. Now, an alliance does not have to be equal, of course, and in the case of the Articles of Confederation, power was not shared equally. In fact, under the Articles, the states had most of the power and the national government had very little. And again, they still had a monarchy hangover, so they didn't want to invest the national central government with a whole lot of power. But the Articles of Confederation failed the nation almost as quickly as it was ratified. Well, that escalated quickly. What happened? Good question, me from that side of the screen. The first reason the Articles failed was because of its structure. Under the Articles, there was no president, no courts, no army, no national money, and maybe most significantly, no power to tax. If the federal government wanted tax revenue from the states, they basically just had to go there, knock on the door, and ask nicely. And you can imagine how that went. Hey, we need some tax revenue. Would y'all mind? Oh, that's a good one. Even more disastrous, under the Articles, a law required 9 out of 13 votes to become ratified, which is known as a supermajority, and it's as difficult to muster as it sounds. And even more ruinous, if Congress wanted to change the Articles themselves, it required a unanimous 13 out of 13 vote, which is about as likely as finding the North American Sasquatch, shaving the North American Sasquatch, and then turning the North American Sasquatch into your weekly bunco partner. Highly unlikely, but that would be awesome. I know. Unless you beat him and he got mad and decided to eat you. Now, we can't be too hard on the Articles of Confederation. The men who wrote it were taking a step in the dark. They had never done this before, and we have to be careful not to judge their efforts based on the rest of the story that we know. I mean, we know that there's going to be another constitution, and that constitution is going to work and govern our land for centuries. But they were doing the best they could, and so we have to be careful not to poo-poo the Articles. Now, maybe the only really good thing to come out of the Articles of Confederation was a land law with a name that still pops after all these years. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Sorry. I fell asleep just saying it. Anyway, lots of people were moving from the eastern coast and pushing into the interior of the Ohio River Valley, and the Northwest Ordinance laid out plans for those territories to eventually apply to the Union for statehood. And under this law, the Union gained the great states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. So the Articles did some good things, but it had many significant weaknesses. But the fatal flaw in the Articles became glaringly apparent in a little episode called Shays' Rebellion, which was the match that set the Articles aflame. Meet Daniel Shays. He was a Revolutionary War veteran who returned to his farm after the war to a mountain of debt. Now, he was owed money for his service in the war, but as you'll remember, Congress had no power to tax and therefore didn't have any money and therefore was not paying its veterans their due. And as you can imagine, old Daniel Shays got pretty grumpy about this, especially when the collections officers started coming around threatening to take his land from him. And then Shays remembered the ideals that kicked off the war from which he had just returned. You'll recall that the Declaration of Independence has this little phrase in it: "But when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security." So Shays went out into the countryside and gathered a bunch of other angry farmers, and they stormed the Massachusetts courthouses and stopped them from rendering judgments and filing bankruptcies. And all of a sudden there was chaos throughout the state. Now, Thomas Jefferson, who was at that moment in France, heard about this little rebellion, and he was delighted. In his own words, he said, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure. Rebellion is poo." Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. Now, here's why this little episode explains the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. When those rebels fell upon the Massachusetts courthouse in their broke farmer rage, the state of Massachusetts picked up the phone and called the President of the United States. Beep, boop, bop, boop, beep, beep, beep. Hey, help! The problem? There was no one on the other line, because under the Articles there was no president and there was no standing army. Well, eventually the Massachusetts merchants hired militiamen to squash the rebellion, but the memory of that rebellion made the Massachusetts elite a little twitchy. And they quickly realized that if the national government wasn't stronger, then all the common people would get angry and start flinging poo, which is to say, rebellion, all over the place like a crazed chimpanzee at the zoo. So the Massachusetts elite began beating the ground and calling out for a new constitution. And next time, we'll see if anyone listened. I'll see you then.